Hello, welcome to Color Light Motion, created and hosted by Victoria Vesna. I'm Bess Rocklitzer, president of the David Vermant Foundation, and today we welcome Ellen Levy. Ellen is a multimedia artist known for exploring the interrelationships between art, science, and technology. Her talk today is titled The Question of Attention and Thomas Wilfred's Lumia. We are very excited for Ellen's presentation and equally excited to hear from her responders. We have Michael E. Goldberg, Principal Investigator of Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute, Jacques Pernoud, art historian specializing in modern contemporary art and media, and Alice Arnold, a documentary media maker and educator. Please enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. And as Beth said, we are super excited about this lecture by Ellen Levy and her responders. I met Ellen years ago now, actually, while she was still president of the College Art Association. Later, we had lots of interactions during her PhD. She visited UCLA many times, both as an artist and as an educator. And what I appreciate most about Ellen is how much she can cross over as an artist and also build community. She is an artist, writer. She explores art, science, technology, interrelationships since the 80s. And she has had many exhibitions, educational programs, curatorial programs, publications. She was the president of CAA, as I mentioned, and before doing her PhD on art and neuroscience, she was a special advisor on the arts and sciences at the Institute for Doctoral Studies in Visual Arts. She's a distinguished fellow in the arts and sciences at the Skidmore College and taught transdisciplinary classes in many different schools, New School, Cooper Union, Brooklyn College, and UCLA even. With Berta Sichel, she guest edited and contributed to CAA's special issue of Art Journal. And this was the first widely distributed academic publication on contemporary art. She also received an ICA award and the Arts Commission from NASA, following a solo exhibition at the National Academy of Sciences. Her exhibitions have been really wide. I could spend half an hour on that, but also with writing as well. She's been incredibly prolific. Most recently, she did a fantastic volume together with Teresa Terranova, the Darcy Wentworth Thompson's Generative Influences on Art Design from Forces to Forms, which was also an exhibition that she curated at Otis. Levy and Barbara Larson co-edit Art and Science since 1750 book series of Redbridge Press. So she is just your regular overachiever. We love Ellen, and we're so happy about having her and her guests, Michael Goldberg, Pierre Pernaud, and Alice Arnold. Welcome, and tell us a little bit more about your plan today, Ellen.
Thank you for that really amazing introduction. And I should add that one of the presenters today, Mickey Goldberg, I could not have done my dissertation without his input. And you'll hear he's really a leading expert on attention. So in this episode of Color, Light, and Motion, we're looking at the work of Thomas Wilfred's Lumia group of works through the lens of attention. Lumia has a very complex relationship to media, technology, and art in a very broad sense. Now, I first came across this work in the early 1960s at the Museum of Modern Art. It was during the heyday of formalism. I was a student at the Museum School of Fine Arts in Boston. I was then embarking on a career in the arts, and the state of the art field was really meaningful to me. At that time, formalism had achieved the force of a master narrative where I was a student. For me, Thomas Wilfred's work provided both a point of resistance and of inspiration, although my own work went in quite a different direction. So I was mesmerized by Clavilux when I saw it at MoMA. It was related to painting concerns with which I was grappling. In addition, it offered a way to think about art as a three-way conversation among art, science, and technology. And I'm very excited to revisit his works today. So to summarize, and let me return to this idea of context. During the 60s, when I first came across it, it was a time of body art, happenings, performance, Carolee Schneeman's Meet Joy. There were challenges to established aesthetics by John Cage, Alan Capro, and Fluxus. And today we'll discuss some of the challenges and inspiration to other artists that Wilfred's work provided. So this is only the beginning. I have invited three guests to serve as responders. Pierre Penouet is an art historian specialized in the history of modern contemporary art and media. In 2022, he received his PhD in art history from Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne. Pierre is currently working on a book manuscript that explores what was termed in the pre- and post-war United States, quote, the art of mobile color, end of quote. That is the projection of abstract visual compositions through optical devices. And he will discuss this. Alice Arnold, another of our presenters, is a documentary media maker and educator. She creates, edits, designs, writes, and photographs projects that explore the urban environment and visual culture, from street art to advertising, and from sidewalks to electric signs. Her films are in collections of university libraries throughout the US and have screened at MoMA and other festivals. She's an IFA photography fellow, a Fulbright fellow in film, and an adjunct professor at the City University of New York. Michael Goldberg, who we call Mickey, is the David Mahoney Professor of Brain and Behavior and Neuroscience and Neurology and Psychiatry and Ophthalmology, Principal Investigator at Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute. He's a member since 2011 of the National Academy of Sciences and was president 2009 to 2010 of the Society for Neuroscience. He received a Distinguished Career Award from the Society for the Neural Control of Movement and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His lifelong research is in attention. So I will ask people to save their questions to the end after all the presentations are made. And if you put them in the chat, there will be a chance to respond to at least several of them. And Mickey Goldberg will now provide a neuroscientific overview of attention in relation to the brain's attention system. Mickey, you're on.
Thanks, Ellen, for that kind introduction. Have to get rid of this. Okay, I did. So when we talk about attention, especially if you went to school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the first person who comes into your mind is William James. He was a philosopher, psychologist, and a physician. And he wrote, everybody knows what attention is. It's the taking possession of the mind in a clear and vivid form out of one of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thoughts. It involves withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. He made us aware of the power of attention to shorten reaction time, enhance perception, and he said there are two varieties of attention. One is non-voluntary. It's brought about by the physical properties of a visual stimulus. He said big things, bright things, moving things. He also said there's voluntary top-down attention, things which are not attention worthy because of their visual properties, but because they somehow are important to you. An example of these kinds of attention is given to us by change blindness. This is Kevin Powell. He's sitting on a bench overlooking Deep Hole Creek in Chincoteague, Virginia. And you're going to see Kevin's picture, a blank, and then another almost identical picture, but there's a difference between the two. And I'm going to give you about 10 or 15 seconds to find that difference. And if you haven't seen it before, it's going to be very difficult. Okay. But did you see the difference? The difference was the cupola on the roof over here. It came and it went. And it's almost impossible to see. But now you can see the next object of change blindness very quickly, right? And that's because your attention was drawn to its spatial location by this yellow circle. And that made it very easy. And the yellow circle evoked your attention because of its physical properties. So looking at art involves both kinds of spatial attention. Bottom up, you look at physically salient aspects of the picture, and top down, you are hardwired to look at certain objects. James said attention was drawn by blood, and I'm going to show you an example of this kind of top-down attention. I want you to look at the fixation point. And then I'm going to show you a painting by Caravaggio called The Triumph of Love. And it's in the Gemälde Galleria in Berlin. Okay, did you see Cupid's face? Did you see his penis? Did you see the sheet music on the floor? Here's the sheet music. So most people don't see the sheet music because they're not important to you. You look at faces, you look at genitalia of naked people. So I'm going to show you another example. Again, look at the fixation point. And I'm going to give you another 15 seconds to see it. This is a landscape by Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's called Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. Did you see the plowman? Did you see the ship? Did you see Icarus's feet? Again, most people don't. And the first time you see this painting, spend a lot of time looking for Icarus. Look at it for 15 seconds. Again, you see the plowman, you see the ship, you see Icarus, and there he is. So even though the painting is named the Fall of Icarus, you didn't see it. So what goes on in the brain when you look at art? Human and monkey eyes have an exquisitely sensitive center called the fovea. When you explore the visual world, you move the fovea rapidly from the current object of attention to the next object of attention. The rapid eye movement is called a saccade, and they move the fovea from one position in the world to another. It's an example of a saccade. A human is looking at a spot, the spot jumps, the human's eye moves in about 200 milliseconds, and it moves very rapidly at 800 degrees per second. We measure eye movements by degrees of rotation. The eye is a ball in a socket. And so a saccade moves the eyes at 800 degrees per second. You're blind during a saccade. If you look at your left eye in a mirror, you look at your right eye, you don't see your eyes move. Have someone standing next to you, they do the same thing. You see those eyes move. So your brain shuts down during a saccade, so you don't have this jiggling world that notices that the scene has changed. And the saccades, as I said, are very fast. Now, the parietal lobe of the cerebral cortex is important in generating visual attention and choosing the targets for saccades. Patients with lesions in the right parietal lobe neglect objects in the visual field, make errors making saccades or reaching to the objects in that field. If you show them two objects, one in the good field, one in the bad field, they're very likely not to tell you about the one in the bad field. Now, in order to study the cortical controls of saccades and attention, we've been studying one area in the monkey's parietal lobe, called the lateral interparietal area, LIP to its friends. When we study the brain, we record the activity of single neurons using a tungsten microelectrode. And neurons at LIP respond to visual stimuli flashed in their receptive field. Now, what do I mean by respond? Neurons give out chains of action potentials, pulse codes. When you move your leg, a series of pulse codes comes down from the spinal cord, and the higher frequency of the pulse codes, the more response you have. For sensory neurons, these pulse codes are evoked by the proper sensory stimuli. So we ask a monkey to look at a fixation point, and when he looks at the fixation point, there's a part of his retina that's sensitive to visual stimuli, not the whole retina, just a small part of it, and that part is called the receptive field. When we ask a monkey to fixate, and we ask him not to make eye movements, not actually to pay attention to that stimulus or respond to it. And the first time the stimulus appears, and it appears at this point in the screen, the neuron starts to emit these series of action potentials. But one trial isn't enough. We do it repetitively. Every time we flash the stimulus, we see this pulse code, and we can turn that into a mathematical function to do analysis. And the key thing about LIP is that the visual response of LIP neurons is modulated by attention. So this is the response of an LIP neuron to a stimulus that was unimportant to the animal. The animal is doing visual search. He's looking for something. He's not looking for the object in the receptive field. But if the object is in the receptive field, you get a much higher pulse code. Look at the difference between this and that. And that difference, we think, is what, by giving more activity to the attended object, is one of the brain mechanisms for attention. We hypothesize that the activity represented in LIP is a priority map. The visual system pins attention to the peak of the priority map. The ocular motor system generates a saccade to the peak of the priority map. And so this is an example of a priority map. Think of this graph paper down here as the map of the visual field in LIP. And the fixation point appears here. And remember, that was the only interesting thing on the screen at the time. And so that's the only peak on the priority map. You flash the whole painting, you get a number of peaks. If you saw the face first, it had the highest peak. But you're not going to want to look at that forever. You're going to realize once you've looked at the face, you want to look at something else. And the next bottom-up stimulus is the genitalia of this young man. And so you see it, you attend to it. But most people don't notice the sheet music on the floor. It didn't appear on the priority map. And so this is fine. It didn't appear on the priority map, and you didn't see it. So what does this have to do with Thomas Wilford? Next slide. All right, start the video. This is a Thomas Wilford video, Opus 147, and look at it for a while. And so something interesting appears, you start looking at it, and it's moving. And so you have to keep looking at it, and you're going to look at it for a while until something more interesting appears on the screen, which could be the orange thing that has appeared on the right of the screen. Next slide, please. Next slide, next slide. Don't show this. Okay, next slide. Next. When the video appears, you make a saccade to a salient object, but it's moving. You have to keep the moving stimulus on the fovea, and the oculomotor system has evolved a mechanism, smooth pursuit, to keep a slowly moving stimulus on the fovea. Next. So this is smooth pursuit. You look at an eye position, and the black line is the eye position and the target position. Again, the target jumps, but now it comes back slowly towards the center of gaze. What you see with the eye position is that it moves at the proper speed, but in the opposite direction, because the velocity system is faster than the position system. Then the subject makes a saccade, pulls his eye over to the stimulus, and now he is keeping that stimulus on the fovea, and he can see it. Okay, next slide. And pursuit provides a unique problem. When pursuit begins, the retinal velocity of the target specifies the desired eye velocity. Next slide. As the eye speeds up, the retinal velocity goes to 0, but the eye should move at the original retinal velocity that said how fast it was. And 3 areas in the cortex provide the information necessary for smooth pursuit. Striate cortex, over the blue in the back of the brain, calculates the velocity of objects on the retina, and also is the first place that vision hits the cerebral cortex. 2 other areas, the middle temporal area, MT, and the adjacent middle superior temporal area, MST, are important now in the analysis of a smooth pursuit target. MT improves the analysis of retinal velocity, but MST specifies the target position in space and the actual eye velocity rather than the retinal velocity. Next slide, please. So MT describes the direction and speed of the moving objects on the retina. What you're seeing is the activity of an MT neuron while the monkey is doing pursuit. It's a neuron that's sensitive to the fovea. And when the monkey starts to fire, starts to pursue, the retinal velocity is large, but it decreases during pursuit. But if the pursuit target blinks, goes out, monkey continues to pursue. He's learned how to do that. But the neuron stops firing, as you can see in the middle of that bottom point. Okay, now let's look in the middle superior temporal area. It describes the direction and speed of the moving objects in the world and the speed and direction of smooth pursuit. Unlike MT, MST activity remains constant during pursuit, even though the retinal velocity decreases. Next slide. Oh, okay. Now back. There are 2. Yeah. So look at the neural activity on the left, and you see it's constant during the pursuit, as although it declined when you looked at M and MT. And unlike MT, MST activity remains constant even when the target blinks. So it's talking about the target position in the world. But smooth pursuit also requires that you pay attention to the target. I demonstrate this to medical students when I teach the oculomotor system, and you can try it yourself. I ask the student to track my moving finger. He does it very well. Then I ask him to count backwards in Spanish from 20 to 1, and their pursuit breaks down because they're no longer giving their full attention to that moving finger. And patients with attentional deficits like Alzheimer's disease have poor smooth pursuit. And so what's the meaning of all this? When you look at a painting, you invoke brain mechanisms for visual attention in the parietal lobe. In the monkey, LIP sets up a priority map for attention and eye movements, which selects part of the painting for you to examine next. And Thomas Wilford introduced motion into the previously static world of visual art. And Looking at his work, you evoke the smooth pursuit system in the temporal lobe to allow you to keep looking at a moving object. Thank you. Sorry for the confusion. Who did the work? James Bisley, the context of the parietal priority map. Next. Anna Ipata and Angela G. Recorded the neurons during visual search. Next. And Bob Wirtz, Bill Newsom, and Hideko Komatsu in the Laboratory of Sensory Motor Research at the Intramural Program of the National Eye Institute did the work on MT and MST. They were neighbors. Thank you.
Nikki, thank you so much. That was a wonderful summary of years and decades of research, I know. Victoria, I'm going to ask you to bring up my PowerPoint now.
Sure.
And
And I just wanted to say, so can you say a few words about your collaboration?
Yes, I thought I would talk while this was being shown, actually. So I'd like you to bring it up. And the animation that I will start by showing that Mickey and I worked on together will make it very clear the importance of attention to every facet of our life. So next, please. First, I'm going to ask you, don't yet start it. Wait. I'd like you'll see a directive to start with, and it will continue. And I'll ask you what you saw at the end of this, and then we'll go into it. Yes, start it now. So this was made 2003 in memory of the US invasion of Iraq. Would you like to play 3-card Monte? All you need to do to win is count how often the Queen of Hearts appears in a cycle. When you see the hands, get ready to start counting. Keep counting. Next slide, please. So let me talk about what you just saw. You will notice there was the yellow circle that Mickey had introduced in his talk. No, don't go to the next. The question is, how can we miss seeing something right before our eyes? And there's been examples in art of dealing with this subject before. There's the Hieronymus Bosch on top, the Conjurer, There's the Georges de la Tour on the bottom left, and on the right, the Caravaggio. And what's key to them all is that it involves distraction. So let me give you the backstory. Next slide, please. By the way, this is an important precedent. We did a variant, but added a very different kind of task and emotional salience to it, to the experiment that Simons and Chabris had done, Gorillas in Our Midst. Some of you may know it, but basically people missed the fact that a gorilla came out during the middle of their video, which no one noticed because they were so busy during the assigned task of counting the number of basketball pitches that were made. Next, please. So how do we miss feeling something? What you saw in this animation are hands playing cards, and you're assigned a task. Three-card Monte is, of course, a con game. Now, here's the backstory to this. In 2008, I heard Donnie George Ukana, director of the National Museum of Iraq, in 2003. He spoke at the time of the US invasion. He relayed that he stayed in the museum to try to prevent some of the vast amount of looting of antiquities that was going on. During the talk that was given, he relayed how an armed, hooded figure broke into his office and he thought he would be killed. But instead, this person with a mask on and he was hooded said that he was not a looter. He was pretending to be one with the goal of rescuing important antiquities. And that is what he did. He returned them several weeks later when it was safe to. These are the missing antiquities, and they were posted by the University of Chicago in one of their sites. This is a typical thing that I saw there. Now, next, the directive to count the Queen of Hearts obscures the fact that these antiquities were being removed from museum shelves one by one as cultural heritage and lives were being lost. To pay attention is to obliterate almost everything but the focus of attention. You see almost nothing. Next, please. And this was part of a multimedia exhibition. It exhibited several places. It utilized a dark installation room, the animation you just saw, and multiple collages. It attempted to offer the viewer several ways to contrast information delivered both slowly and quickly. The role of the static artworks and black room installation within it was to provide a kind of contextual cueing that those notices that have been posted by the University of Chicago indicated. They were all over the place. Now, in this case, the distractors, the hands playing the cards and the yellow circle were the most obvious thing to look at. However, what was so interesting was that people almost uniformly saw only the hands and tried to get a count of the number of times they saw the Queen of Hearts, because that was the thing they saw at the beginning of the exhibition. But when they were basically led by the layout through the rest of the exhibition, and then the exhibition all of a sudden became contextualized by both the title, the emotional salience of a cultural heritage, images of the thefts. And people, when they came back and saw it a second time, and I asked the same question of them, some of them could see simultaneously the objects being removed, as well as the antiquities, which was interesting. Now, to be sure, I played the animation at a far faster speed that would make it very difficult to actually count them. Next, please. And what I realized was that you could apply this whole topic in attention blindness to environmental changes going on around us, because at the same time of the invasion, very few people were paying attention to global warming, for example. And what I started to do was blue images of proliferation of viruses and bacteria to some of the pipes in one of the exhibition spaces. So people had to look up and add objects that they normally would not pay attention to. Next, please. In this, I used a program called Cellular Automata to multiply the cellular-looking bacterial growths in the middle of each of them. But I also used the concept of change blindness rather than inattention blindness, so that you don't notice necessarily the difference between the image on the right, which has the sort of tripod setup, and on the left, which is without it. Next, please. And again, the important thing here is that without attention, nothing is seen. So I see what Mickey and I did as a way to try to make vivid the concept, and people can see what it is for themselves. So the next speaker we have is Pierre Pernouillet, and he will show how Wilfred's art conditions viewers to pay attention in a very particular way. I was very intrigued reading his research, and I know you will be too. So I turn the floor over to Pierre.
Hi. Just let me share my screen. Here we go. So I should first start by thanking Ellen, as well as everyone at UCLA and the Berman Foundation for the invitation. So as Ellen said, I've recently defended a dissertation not only on Wilfred, but by and large on what was called in the 20s the art of mobile color. So it's Wilfred, but also other experimenters working with light. And one aspect of my dissertation was returning to the original context of Lumia and looking at what was happening in the interwar period. And in that period, Lumia, what Wilfred called Lumia, was characterized by a spectacular and theatrical dimension that I think has something to do with this notion of attention, and I'll be discussing this. Wilfred's first successes in the 20s were through the format of visual recitals. So 1 hour long series of short visual sequences played in public upon this clever but large and complex optomechanical device that the Clavilux was originally. So Wilfred turned back this mobile color medium, this idea of a new art, something that was very spectacular. There was a mass medium, as you can see on this and these photos. And these light shows are characteristic of the first phase of Wilfred's career. And there's a second dimension to it, art, dimension that is luckily easier to experience as country viewers. And here I'm referring to the automatic Lumia, the automatic Claviluxes that Wilfred started building in the early 30s. And I'm speaking here of work such as the one that is in the Berman collection, a machine that was, or an instrument rather, that was initially conceived by Wilfred as a domestic Lumia, so literally as the home version of this large Clavilux. And as Ellen said, I'm going to discuss this notion of attention, and I will be doing so by focusing on this idea that may seem a bit extravagant from a contemporary perspective. It is this idea of a new art form, of an eighth art form, as Wilfred called it, which I think is one of the most fascinating and interesting aspects of Wilfred's work. And it's something I'm studying through the lens of media archaeology, and I'm seeing that Erki Utamo is online. So this is a methodology I'm using a lot and reading a lot of his articles. So I pay homage here. And this idea of a new medium is interesting because I think it reflects the fact that Wilfred's idea of Lumia in its original context was something that happened and was set in a very competitive media environment. And that's something that film historians have insisted on, like the early 20th century, with a very competitive environment between cinema and perhaps also the nascent medium of television. And what is interesting in Wilfred is obviously the fact that within this competitive environment, he carved out a space for creating art with technology. And I believe this idea of the competition between media is fundamentally a competition to attract the attention of the spectator. And I'm here drawing on a vast literature that Mickey Goldberg probably knows. And I'm really thrilled of having like a scientific authority on the topic, because what I'm dealing with as an historian are perhaps mostly like Wilfred's intuition on the matter of attention. And this vast body of work on the concept of attention insists on the fact that attention, but not only attention, the dialectic between attention and distraction, as Ellen just said, is something that is characteristic of what, as a historian, we call modernity. So something that goes back to the late 19th century, but also that has certain echoes in the present. This is something we find in the writings of Walter Benjamin, who describes the cinema goer as a distracted subject, in the writings of Baudelaire, on how like the flâneur is the one who strolls through the street of Paris and is inherently distracted. This is something that art historians have greatly elaborated upon. I'm thinking of Jonathan Crary in here. I'm thinking also of like more recent quantitative approach to the problem of attention, and studies who have analyzed the extension of the duration of film over the last few decades, the fastest pace of montage in film, and the ability of people to read faster or slower, and those kind of problem. And one source of mine in that matter is the writing of a French philosopher, Yves Citon, who proposed this notion of an ecology of media that would describe a media landscape into which the subject is never completely distracted nor completely attentive, but is in between. And I could give many other examples of this literature, but my topic in here is Wilfred and his view on the place of technological art within this modern ecology of attention. And I would just start with a very little known aspect of Wilfred's work, which is the use of his large clavilux inside movies theater in the 1920s. And this reminds us that Wilfred is not just an artist, he was also like a very skilled lighting engineer, and that he conceived a lot of lighting devices that were, interestingly enough, described in the film trade press as technical means to help the distracted cinema goer to focus their attention on the screens. And the common idea and fear in the 1920s was that it was physically impossible to focus one's attention on a screen for 2 hours. And the clavilux, through the projection of adjacent colored lights, would help create an environment that would that would help improve the attention of spectators. So that's the first element. And I think that this is precisely color that was for Wilfrid one aspect essential to his understanding of attention. There's something very unique to experimenting Lumia. I'm not gonna insist on that, and I hope that all of our viewers today will have the chance to experience Lumia at some point, because it's something that is very different in real life. And I know that Eugene and AJ Epstein are here, and they're probably the people on Earth who watch the most Lumia, so they have an idea of what I'm talking about in here. And there are very different ways of watching Lumia. And I think it depends a lot on the context, which is why exhibiting Lumia is never an easy enterprise. And Wilfrid was himself very concerned about this aspect and insisted on the comfort of the spectator. I think it's part of the will, again, to create an environment to foster a better form of attention. And this is why I brought this example, I think, somehow similar to the form of attention that was expected from early TV viewers. And you see here on the left a photograph of the Clavellux Jr. at the Wanamaker store in Philadelphia, in a setting that very much reminds contemporary ads for radio and television, where you have like this woman subject that is enthralled by the spectacle of the Clavellux, and it's almost at the level of hypnosis. And I think that it adds to Wilfrid's interest in questions of attention, which also in his early career, in his mind, I think had something to do with the physical properties of light. And he's a bit misleading in here, but Wilfrid insists on the fact that light is the greatest force our senses can grasp. And I think by saying this, he's talking about the spiritual quality of light, but also about possibly its therapeutic value. And in Wilfrid's paper, there are many signs of his interest in, for example, what we now call radiation therapy. So the possibility to cure with light. And Wilfrid also realized that light could be something very destructive. And Wilfrid was also interested in certain science fiction theme in the 20s, like this idea of the death ray, like an arm that could kill people at a distance through light. So I think that how he attempted to explain the kind of very particular relation to attention in Lumia had, let's say, at start a physiological basis, but very quickly he moved on to something more elaborated. This the next step, let's say, where what is called in psychology color preference studies. So Wilfrid would typically ask viewers of his early Lumia spectacles to fill a questionnaire after each séance, after each performance, and they were asked to indicate their age and their sex. And Wilfrid progressively got more interested into psychology, and that the shift in, I think, his understanding of attention that happens in the mid-30s. And Wilfrid stopped being interested in physiological aspects and the material quality of light, and understood the matter of attention exclusively through psychology. And this is a topic I've discussed in an article I've published, because in my mind, this shift towards psychology happens with a parallel in between Wilfrid's Lumia and the Rorschach test. And this starts with a coincidence that is quite striking, which is the fact that what Wilfrid described in the 40s as the three formal factors of Lumia, which is form, color, and motion, corresponds precisely to the three categories of perception that the German psychologist Hermann Rorschach talks about in his book on this psychodiagnostic he invented in 1921, and something we probably some of our viewers have experienced. I should tell that this coincidence is evident when we considered a machine. This, I think, I could call it a machine and not an instrument, that is now lost, and from which, to my knowledge, there's no existing photograph of the kind of imagery it projected. But it was very similar to the example I will be showing in a minute. And the instrument was housed in a cabinet. It had a translucent screen and was projecting a loop of color light effect. And one very special feature of this machine was that it was synchronized to an audio recorder, so that psychologists using it could record words and exclamation from the patient watching the machine, and later coordinate these reactions to the image that was seen on the screen at a particular time. So it was this synchronization. It was a technical mean to explore a connection between a particular form or color and a particular psychological effect. Unfortunately, it was a failure, as the psychologist who experimented with Wilfred on that machine was never able to secure to prove that such connection existed. But again, we have something that is very close from the here's the inside of the machine. We have something that is very close from the Rorschach ink test that was created by dropping spots of ink on a paper, and that was then folded, which was, according to Rorschach, a method to prevent what is scientifically called as pareidolia, which is the tendency to recognize figurative patterns where they actually do not exist. And the idea of Rorschach was to create form that would be so neutral in a way that the viewer could kind of recognize certain elements that were familiar to him, so that the psychologist could himself recognize different kind of habits of perception that are specific to individual. And that's exactly the way the fundoscopes was used by psychologists. But what is interesting is the fact that after the first experiments with the fundoscope, the psychologist suggested that perhaps the fundoscope was something more than the Rorschach, that perhaps it had a therapeutic value that the original test had not. And by therapeutic value, they didn't mean that the patient were cured, but they meant that after having focused their attention on Lumia for a certain time, certain patients, in particular schizophrenic patients, spoke more freely about their feeling, and that their way of describing the fundoscope somehow freed their imagination. And this corresponds to a reinterpretation of the Rorschach in the 1930s that was developed in the States. And here I brought an example with the psychologist William Stern called cloud pictures. And this reinterpretation consists in transforming the original Rorschach test into a test to measure the imagination abilities of patients. And as many people suggested in the 1930s, when it comes to measuring the imagination, the original Rorschach test was very limited because of the fact that the inkblot outlines are too sharp and the forms used by the Rorschach are too symmetrical. And these aspects were supposed to be restricting the imagination. And if you wanted it to free the imagination and to better measure it, you had to go towards clouds, you had to go towards the informal. And this is why the Wilfred's fundoscope appears in the psychological literature of the interwar period as an improvement, as a technological improvement of the original fundoscope. And this is where I'm going to conclude my intervention. I'm going to conclude on this beautiful example of Wilfrid's domestic clavilux in the background. So what you're seeing is a model that is very similar to the one that's in the Berman collection, and I think is a radical example of what I've just described, which is the informal nature of Lumia. And I'm calling this radical because usually Wilfrid's composition have a more formal structure, and this is kind of a rare case. And to be more precise, Wilfrid rarely used geometry or hard edge kind of imagery, but usually there's, let's say, more an element of what Wilfrid called a drama of light. It's almost a script of light. And here it is very difficult to find such dramatic elements, I believe. It's very difficult to focus your attention on one detail in particular, because having experienced this instrument in real life, the details are just too many and too fine. It's actually too complicated, I believe, to apprehend this through the fine details. So you end up considering the ensemble. And I think this global approach to the image somehow relates to this reinterpretation of the Rorschach as a projective method, as an image that is loose and onto which you can project your subjectivity, that was of interest for psychologists in the interwar period. And I believe that this idea of an expansion of consciousness and an expansion of imagination was very pleasing to Wilfrid, because it helped him differentiate his art form from other kind of media, other kind of art forms. And contrarily to the viewers of the cinema or the television that Wilfrid describes in his writing, yes, Lumia required a very heightened form of attention, but there was a reward to this very demanding form of attention. That was precisely this idea that you would expand your capacity to imagine, and you would somehow expand your consciousness, which is a theme that Wilfrid described at great length in his writing. And these would be my last word, and I thank you so much for the invitation.
Pierre, thank you so much. That raises so many questions for me, and actually after our next speaker, I'd like to have a dialogue about many of the things we've heard about. For example, elaborating on the idea how Wilfrid's art really has you focus on attention in a particular manner. I think also of an artist like Morris Lewis, and also the show at MoMA that Wilfrid, I believe, was included in. It would be interesting to get into this. So our next presenter is Alice Arnold, who's a documentary media maker and educator. I summarized her bio, but I've asked her to speak about the reception of Wilfrid's work in his lifetime, and what's happening with it now. Alice.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start to screen share in a moment. And as I'm doing that, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me, as I am a huge Wilfrid fan and always very excited to talk about him. And as you said, I was asked to talk about his influence. So we're going to track back and forth a little bit through time travel, as Wilfrid likes to do, and look at some other examples of work and culture that Wilfrid was involved in. So let me try to get into the slideshow mode, and hopefully this works and there's no hiccups. Thomas Wilfrid was a singular figure in the canon of 20th century Western art. However, he is not such a well-known name among the general public, and not even among people who regularly visit museums. But his influence has seeped into many aspects of modern culture, visual culture, and his work is inspirational to many, including myself. What we're looking at here is a chart that some of you might be familiar with because it references Alfred Barr's well-known diagram showing the development of cubism and abstract art that he created in 1936 for a show at MoMA. Alfred Barr, of course, was MoMA's founding director. He was also a champion of Wilfred's work. He included it in the permanent collection. They purchased pieces, and one of Wilfred's work was on display at MoMA from 1964 to 1980. That holds the record as the longest artwork at MoMA that was on continuous display. At the top of this chart, you can see that Wilfred was influenced by the spiritualist philosophy, theosophy, which is here Helen Blavatsky, and early abstract art like Cubism and Kandinsky and Hilma af Klint, and Steiner's part of the more spiritual philosophy elements. So these inputs, along with his interest and fascination in light, which he had since he was a young man and a boy actually, led to his development of this new form of visual expression based on light, color, and time, as we saw from Pierre's presentation. What this chart illuminates, the way I designed it, is two main strands of his influence. And one of them is popular culture, such as television, and 60s psychedelic light show, and also tech-infused screen culture, the Fleury screensaver as an example. And the other relevance of Wilfred, of course, is to experimental avant-garde art production, from his contemporaries, the abstract expressionists, to then later variations of avant-garde experimental art, kinetic art, video art, and of course the light and space artists from California, and contemporary light artists, and artists like Ellen, art and science makers. So Wilfred's work bridges the span from high art to popular culture because his light compositions, which unfold in a slow and mesmerizing way, create a deeply emotional experience. Wilfred immigrated to the United States in 1916. He was already a trained artist, and he was an experienced performer of folk music. He joined this theosophy group called the Prometheans, and they were all interested in using light as an expressive medium. From that group, he goes off on his own and he creates the Clavilux as a performance machine. So he is performing, as you've seen also in Pierre's lecture, his talk, to a large public audience. And again, he had a background already in popular culture, popular performance to people. And these compositions that he's playing, they're silent, they're colorful, and he calls them lumia. Now, Wilfred's first public performance was in 1922 at the Neighborhood Playhouse. That's part of the Henry Street settlement in the Lower East Side, a neighborhood actually that I live in. And this neighborhood, it's an immigrant working class neighborhood. For film historians, this neighborhood is also known because it was a place that had many Nickelodeons, which is the very early form of cinema, small storefront spaces that screened the early silent films. By 1922, the Nickelodeons had already been replaced by movie palaces. Silent films would soon be replaced by talkies. But it is in this milieu of popular entertainment, including jazz and neon signs, that Wilfred launches his own form of silent, luminous visual performance. Wilfred's Clavilux performances were very popular and ongoing in New York City and other cities up until 1943. He started something called the Art Institute of Light, and he had to close that down during World War II. Meanwhile, he starts, before he even closes down the Art Institute of Light, he starts to work on home machines. And what you're looking at, he calls them Clavilux Junior. So what you're looking at is also pictures that we saw from Pierre's of the Clavilux Junior in the collection of David Beaumont. And this was released in 1930. So he is now creating a self-performing machine to display abstract kinetic art for home use. And as you can see in the photos here, it's an Art Deco cabinet, and it was designed to blend in with living room furniture. But when the screen opened, it became a portal, and quoting Wilford, that looks into the vast depths of space. Now, Clavlux Jr. Predates commercial television. So here you can see a commercial television screen from 1945 and understand the relationship between the sense of this cabinet and something fitting in with living room furniture. But Wilford, he thought that his machine, the Clavlux Jr., would become as popular as household radios. And of course, as we all know, a different type of screen took over the living room, the TV. So though these two technologies are connected through their use of screens for home use, entertainment, their content diverges wildly. Lumia's composition are slow, contemplative, they're abstract, they're brightly colored. Television, particularly television advertising, it's a rapid collage of images and sounds, and of course its purpose is to promote consumption. So the same sort of design form and very, very different ideas of content. Skipping some decades forward, I want to highlight two other screen works that are relevant to this discussion. Nam June Paik is a pioneer of video art. He also used Wilford's term of Lumia to discuss his work, his light art work, these video abstractions he made. And this piece of his Magnet TV from 1965 subverts television's cultural and economic authority by converting the video single, an electronic single, into an abstract work of light art. The other example you see here is Flurry, the screensaver that was launched on Macintosh in 2002. And here we see, Wilford's analog light art updated to the digital age with the use of LCD and LED lighting technology. This banal screensaver, a function that is activated when the computer is inactive, when there's no work going on, provides a meditative diversion from work. And I wonder if Wilford would have found it amusing or interesting or not. Maybe some people like Eugene can comment on that later. I was going to play you some Lumia. You've seen some already. And then just a very short clip, and then a short clip of Eugene Epstein filmed talking about the inside of the machine. Now this machine, the one we're looking at, is Opus 161. It is in the collection of Carol and Eugene Epstein. And it's about 3 minutes long. Let's see if we can get this playing here.
Walk yourself carefully over here so I can show you the innards of Big Boy. This is how it works. There's a 200-watt light bulb inside this lamp chamber. And this rotating color wheel, it's probably rotating too slow for you to get it on the recording, but it's rotating very slowly underneath that light source. So the light coming down goes through this cylinder that has reflective interior. And there's also a dividing mirror in the very middle of it. So colored light is coming down through that cylinder, and it's changing. The colors are changing very slowly as the color wheel rotates. That light then proceeds to these reflectors, these shaped. The secret is how these things are shaped. They may look like just piece of bent metal, and so they indeed are bent metal, but it's how they are bent. It's how you put the pigment on a canvas that makes all the difference in the world. So that colored light is hitting these reflecting surfaces, carefully shaped reflecting surfaces, and it's hitting two of them, and they're both rotating, and the light from here goes out to there and then to the screen. And what you saw in the middle of the screen was what had come down and directly hit here and went out to the screen. But also, you'll notice there's some other reflectors up here. Some light that's hitting these rotating surfaces comes up to these other reflectors, which you see only the black backsides of. And so some light that's fairly spread out by now then goes to the screen, and that adds additional complexity to the composition.
Let me get out of that, sorry. So hopefully Eugene can speak more about the way the Lumiere works. Moving on, continuing with this popular culture thread, where there's also a direct connection between Wilford's work and the performative light shows of the 1960s. These light shows with their psychedelic swirls and abstract patterns, optical illusions, and vibrant colors helped create the visual culture of the 1960s. Many of the psychedelic era artists were inspired to work with light after seeing Wilford's work. This image that you're seeing here is Joshua White's light show at the Fillmore East. And he said, quote, he was informed as a teenager by seeing Wilford's work displayed at MoMA. And he goes on to say that that visual image stayed in his mind, and 10 years later, he was able to superficially recreate the visual idea for his early light shows. So I'm working with Rain Lake Productions on a documentary film about the Joshua Light Show, and Lumia will be part of that, and Eugene Epstein is part of that, as you just saw. And we're going to show you the trailer to the film, which isn't finished yet, at the end of my presentation. So we'll see some of this in action. Now going back in time and looking at some of Wilford's influence in the experimental avant-garde art sphere, it's been documented that Jackson Pollock, whose work you're looking at here, visited many times Wilford's Art Institute of Light. So they knew each other, or of course they knew of each other's work. Wilford was in a show at MoMA in 1952 called 15 Americans, and that show included Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, William de Kooning, and other artists of this era who were, experimental abstract expressionist artists. One common denominator among all of these artists in that show was that their work focused on visualizing movement in time. Most of the people in the show were painters, so nobody else was doing moving work like Wilford was. And Wilford researcher Maybrit Morgan writes that she thinks it's not unreasonable to think that Jackson Pollock, because it's documented that he spent time at Wilford's Art Institute of Light in the 1930s. She writes that She thinks that Wilford's Lumia recitals may have influenced Pollock's thinking about painting. Wilford described Lumia as a drama of moving form and color. And so that does seem to be an apt description for Pollock's action paintings, as you see here, this one from 1947. He created these paintings in a performative manner, with the canvas on the floor and splattering and hurling, and in a very physical performance way, putting the paint on the canvas. And Wilford was instrumental, like the founder of light art. So there's been many different light artists from the 1960s on who's been incredibly impacted by Wilford's work. James Turrell prominently among them. And James Turrell says he first saw Wilford's Lumia at MoMA in 1957. And he described the experience as seeing light alive. That's a very potent thought. And Pierre, you also spoke to some of those issues about light as something maybe healing. Turrell, as you can see from this image, creates immersive spaces that are crafted from light. So he has opened up Wilford's portal, and he beckons us to walk into the light, to experience, as Wilford wrote, quote, the majestic, the unearthly, that which is not connected with the activities and movement of the human being. And finally, I'm going to show you, this is the trailer.
An old mirror from an old video projector from the 70s, a light bulb on the end of a stick, color, shiny things, oil, water, and a very powerful light source. It's not very complicated. It's what you do with it once you've got control of it that's important. Right now, I'm working with several artists who are very interested in the old liquid light chemistry. We used to call them the arcane arts, or mixing the druid fluids.
It's like being part of a very secret society or a special coven of alchemists.
The light show was very cinematic. We take light and we interpret music with it.
You're dancing. You can manipulate live in time what you see on the screen and make it move exactly how you want to.
It's very emotional because you're in this wonderful zone. I'm 70, but I'm 25 when I do the light show. For that hour and a half, I am 25. When we began in 1967, just getting light up on a screen, not being washed out, not being overwhelmed by the power of the rock and roll was hard work. None of the technology existed. We had to invent it all. What's old is new again. Over 4 decades later, the Joshua Light Show is back. People want to see something done by hand as opposed to something generated on a computer. And that's what we do.
The improvisation is key. That's the magic that makes it work so well together.
There is no script. There are no cues. We have to really immerse ourselves in the music. People have no idea how we do it or what we're doing, but every show is new and original.
You put the drop of color in a plate and cross your fingers and hope it does what you want it to do. When it doesn't, that's the best part.
I love it. We've never fully explored how many possibilities there are.
Okay, you're getting your standing O.
Alice,
What a
thank you so
wonderful
much.
way
Good note
to
to
wonderful
end on.
way to end with this amazing string of presentations that give so many different dimensions to what we're looking at. And Ellen, really, it's pretty amazing how you're presenting art-based research, basically, because your artwork is showing, and the way you're approaching it is showing that you're aware of the lineage and you're aware of what goes into it, and how much time goes into working like this is pretty spectacular. When I visited the Vermont Foundation with graduate students for many years, I was always, every single time, maybe one or two exceptions over decades, accompanied by Erkki Huftamo, who's my colleague and friend. And his work was to show to graduate students, and we participated in this, that there's nothing new. And so I love how you presented, Alice, in the end, that there's this whole lineage that's happening that we're part of, including, which wasn't brought up, and I can briefly show it, that Wilfred also was the first to do the interactive kind of device, right? So you weren't just sitting there, you were actually interacting with the piece. I can show it very briefly.
Yes.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Here we go. This is John Hood, who showed a work, and he never met David, but he was always there.
The ability that he had to
Do you hear
collect
this?
art later on in
You could
his
make it louder if you can.
career of collecting. So things
I'll just speed up to it. So here we go. That's
of
the
a
part.
remote control, even though it's not so remote, you can see with the large cord. But what it does, it allows us to appreciate the color strategies going on in the light box. So here with this device, I can change its saturation, take it out, increase it, and I can even go to another hue. And so that's what a lot of these devices are doing, is for us to manipulate some of the imagery. And how it works is...
So you saw how it works. Eugene showed us, and actually Erkki and I visited his collection a while back. I'll just say one last thing. Alice, I love that you presented how this was pre-TV. And to me, I heard David say this a long time ago, that Thomas Wilfred imagined every household with this Lumia, with the Clavilox, the Junior. What a different world it would be. What a different world. It's almost like the fight for, between Tesla and Edison, like who's going to hold energy, who's going to control it. And what we ended up with is pretty sad. So it's great to see that the young generation and the new students coming in are super interested in light and in more spiritual aspects of work. It's wonderful. Anyway, so I'll hand it over to Eugene and Erkki to start with. Eugene, you have the largest collection, probably the collection in the world. Is it true that Thomas never really sold his work, or very little of it was sold during his lifetime?
Oh, untrue. Practically most everything he did was sold. There were a few things in his studio at the time of his death, including a big boy, quote unquote. It was Opus 161, untitled. I must remind all the viewers what we're showing the excerpts here, as you saw it on your computer monitor, is a very poor, as Alice is nodding in agreement, a very poor representation of the experience. Wilfred, it's analog art, and Wilfred intended it to be viewed in person. Of course, this is a long time before computer video taping and the web and so on. So by the time we were just watching on our monitors at home is just, it only hints at what the real experience is. I've got to jump in and say one thing that was just said a moment ago by Victoria about what things would be like if indeed every home had a Clavilux Junior. What a different environment we live in. In one sense, something that's not been talked about, Wilfred made many drawings of one of the projects he envisioned, a carillon of light, a tower of light. Nowadays, with the low cost of LED lighting, tall buildings, short buildings all around the world are lit up with varying colors, changing colors. And if Wilfred were alive today, he'd be absolutely delighted to see this realization of one of his ideas. So that's a footnote. He did sell most of his work, but privately. He knew enough people, and one person spoke to the other. Some of the people that bought his works after World War II knew each other or passed the word around. In my case, like Ellen, I was a grad student in Cambridge in 1960 and made an excursion in New York and visited MoMA. And that was when I first discovered Wilfred, and then got in touch with him and bought a work from him in 1965 and kept in touch with him until he died. I think in general, Wilfred would be absolutely delighted to have heard this discussion by Ellen and Mickey and Pierre and Alice. Just that people are still talking about him and the great, he was interested in science. He had an active amateur's interest in science. And it was the subject of many of his and my conversations and correspondence. So he would be delighted to hear about all this neuroscience thing that Mickey talked about. He would be overjoyed, I think, if I could channel Wilfred.
You know,
Thank you for that.
Oh, that was wonderful. I love your insights, and I love everybody's contributions. And I will open it up because people may have written in questions. But I have a comment for Alice. You know, listening to your presentation and looking at Barr's famous diagram, which I know very well, it occurs to me that you could add another branch easily of generative art.
Mm-hmm.
Because that really is part of what I see going on, really from a hands-on to other methods of generating an art form. What I really loved about what you and Pierre brought out was also the connection with painting. I couldn't help but think of people like Morris Lewis. And in reading more about Wilfred's work, I realized that he really did not want music as part of it. He wanted the light to be the primary structure and really did not want to include music. So I'd be interested in both, in all of your responses. And excuse the noisy bird in the background. I'm going to put myself on mute while people discuss this. Maybe you could lead that, Victoria.
Yes, so I would like to hear from Erkki, since we have now two media archaeologists in the room. So Erkki, you were...
Yes, yes, hi everyone. And it's actually been very inspiring to have this kind of a, shall we say, multifaceted presentation about Wilfred, which really shows, I mean, how much there is to say, and probably this is not all. I think there's much more. So in my case, I've never written really a study dedicated to Wilfred, but I've been teaching Wilfred for many, many years. And as Victoria explained, so we always had the tradition of taking the grad students to Vermont so that we could actually explore the Clavilux Junior in person. And I think that this is somehow like related to just a couple of observations that I always find intriguing about Wilfred. So first thing is exactly what Ellen just mentioned, is this transition from music to actually to sort of like silent music of images, which as you know, it wasn't mentioned exactly, but he was a Renaissance lute player who gained quite a lot of reputation as a performing musician, and then fairly rapidly came this transition. And so the idea that if we think about all the others who were producing kind of like visual music in the early 20th century, I think that the fact that Wilfred as a professional musician then in a way completely switched to the silent music of the sounds is very, very special. And I think that needs even more reflection and explanations, because I mean, if you think about, for example, Oscar Fischinger or all the other people who produced sort of like color light music, so this was normally happened in combination with sounds and images. So all the way from Scriabin's early experiments with Prometheus and so on. So this whole idea that Wilfred obviously felt that there was some kind of like a complementarity between these things, but these two things didn't have to be fitted in together. I find that always very, very intriguing, and probably maybe there would be someone here who would have some reflections about why exactly that may have happened in his case. So obviously another point would be that he was against filming Lumia from those screens of his devices. So the idea that Lumia was always live, so it was something which happening in time, and should not be recorded in films. So I think that this is another important point to think about. And the third point is the fact that, so I have a long history of being interested in a kind of an archaeology of interactive media. So where this idea of artworks and technological systems where we actually are sort of like no longer sort of like put that to a certain kind of a distant meditative relationship between an artwork, and instead are sort of like becoming sort of like part of that experience through which those experiences unfold. And I think that in that sense, so not only his early those light color projectors from the 20s on, but especially the Clavilux Junior is highly interesting, because here, as we saw from Victoria's video, so this is an early example with a remote controller. And so this idea about adjusting those different modalities of that experience is a very important part of that. Now we know, of course, that not everything, and actually this is probably not even a sort of like a very dominant feature of his life's work in general. So this kind of interactive proto-interactive relationship with that medium, but it is highly interesting that came up. Finally, I think that there was maybe a couple of names that might have been still listed here. I think Nicolas Schoeffer is an example whose work fits very, very interestingly into this sort of like lineage, because not only because of the towers he built, but kind of kinetic towers, but also because he took the idea of creating these Lumia machines for the home that were made by Philips and sold. You know, there were several different models, But there was also a difference because he was very much a certain kind of engineering-oriented figure who had this like cybernetic vision of the society. And I think that Wilfred had much more this link between a certain kind of, as we saw, from anthroposophy to psychological experimentation. So there are similarities, but also differences if we chose to follow that line from Wilfred to Schoeffer and so on. But there would be too many things to say. I don't want to dominate this discussion. These were kind of things that came to my mind, and I think that I also got some tentative answers from these presentations today. So thank you for everybody, and I'm curious to see what other comments will show up.
Well, I greatly appreciate your comments. Everyone's point of view is really right on the mark here. It's so helpful. Yes, Pierre, you.
If I may, I have some answers to some of the 4 points that Herky underlined. At least like some interpretation. I'm not saying that I have the truth, but and I think they are somehow all connected. So you said that you were interested in this transition from music to silence, and in my mind, like the interest of Wilfred is that he shows that what we call visual music in the history of film was actually more complex and was also a matter of technology. And you mentioning Fischinger, for example, is a very good example because Fischinger was very opposed to the technological necessity of building instruments to implement visual music. And there really was a divide in the field of visual music between should we use film or should we create a new technology? And when I said that I was interested in this idea of creating a new art, it's a matter of technological. And so I would say that like the visual music is sometimes metaphorical and sometimes very instrumental, and Wilfred lies in the instrumental kind of field. And I think this relates to the second point you mentioned, which is the idea of being against film, of refusing any connection whatsoever with cinema, and how this relates to your third point, which is the idea of an archaeology of interactive media. I'd say I understand this through what I've discussed in the beginning of my talk, which is the idea of a competitive media environment. And in my mind, mobile color belongs to what media archaeologists would call a different discursivity that is indeed purely interactive, and that was from scratch against cinema because cinema liked interactivity. And what I've discovered in Wilfred Notes is how he had formulated a critique against cinema, cinema being like an automatic medium that restricted the possibility of imagination and that had to be superseded through interactive means. And the use of the term interaction actually appears in that sphere of mobile color, not through Wilfred, but through Mariella Greenwald, who uses it in the early 30s. And this is very big in the critical reception of Wilfred in the 20s and 30s, where Wilfred is described as the new expressionist cinema, but not in a literal sense, in a narrative sense, more in a technical sense, like a cinema that would allow to express his emotion directly. And finally, in my mind, this goes, if we follow the chronology, the interactive lineage, it goes until cybernetic, because the followers of Wilfred, like someone like Charles Dockham, for example, was talking about interactivity also, but using cybernetics and using Norbert Wiener and using like the science of control and servo mechanism and all. So I see a continuity, let's say, of the instrumental tradition of visual music in later on computer graphic. And this was, and you ending on Nicholas Schoeffer is very interesting, because the comparison between Schoeffer and Wilfred in the 1960s is always very bad for Wilfred, because Wilfred is always pictured as someone who is very 19th century kind of in synesthesia, and Schoffer is pictured as someone who's cybernetic and very technologically oriented, when actually their mechanisms are very similar, and there are certain reminiscence in Schoffer's of symbolist idea, and Eugene mentioning earlier, like the visual carrion of Wilfred, which is exactly one of it's an earlier form of Schoffer's cybernetic tower, because it's meant to express the emotion of the city. So it's meant to be there's a feedback relationship, which I think is very interesting. But yeah, thank you so much.
So we have generative art coming back into the question. Camille is asking about the connections between Lumia and generative art. I'm assuming she wants you to unpack it a little more.
Would you like me to discuss that, or perhaps
Whoever, everybody.
Well, I think that essential to the idea of generative art is feedback, the way something gets propelled forward at the next stage. It can be done algorithmically in code, or it could just be done mechanically as well. It doesn't have to be a computer, but there are different ways of generating an artwork, or having some of it be automatic. In the examples I showed early on of my own work, I was using a cellular automata program. So, I mean, I think, but, you know, a lot of things can fit into the topic of generative art, depending upon whether it's handmade and mechanical means, whether it's done with a code. And I just think, or even screen art, which was one of the categories that you had introduced, Alice, as part of the bar diagram, would maybe be part of generative art, because most of those are based on recurring algorithms.
Sorry, the question was specifically generative code art. So specifically to the code, the generative.
I probably could not speak to the mathematics or actual translation of that. Other people would be better to do that.
Anybody else wants to take it on? No? Eric, you can do it.
I can definitely say, because just as a couple of thoughts about this, because so in a certain way, I think when we think about Wilfred's work, so there's a certain kind of a fluidity and the kind of like a continuous transformation, which goes against the kind of like dividing this certain kind of stream of images into bits, so it's like discrete units. So in other words, I think there's a certain kind of analog quality in almost anything that he starts. So it's Wilfred's work is an art of continuous transformation in terms of those elements, so the visuals and the modalities of the qualities of light and that kind of things. So in that sense, my first reaction, I haven't been thinking about this at all, but probably would be that there is not much in relationship if we think about generative art in the digital sense. It is generative in the sense that there's a constant regeneration of the quality of the image and obviously other elements of that situation. But I do, as my first reaction, see it as belonging to somewhere else on the certain kind of spectrum of like visual creation and presentation.
It seems to me that it also raises questions of emergence, and the way in which he is generating these images, can it lead to something totally unpredictable, a quality that hadn't been, so to speak, programmed in, although it's analog. and because I think he was interested in that element of surprise.
There was another question. If any one of you have looked at Frank Molina's Lumidyne works, and that's actually a very good connection. I didn't think of it myself. I've looked at those works. They absolutely are amazing, and I'm sure 100% that he must have been aware of it, of Wilfred's work. But I don't know how it fits into lineage unless we decide to fit it in there.
I'll comment a little bit, but I'm afraid without too much solidity to my comments. I knew Frank Molina, and I met him in Paris the first time, 1966, of course, went earlier, saw the Lumidynes there. Very different than Wilfred, although they were both trying to work in light art, but Frank had a lot of other ideas that I cannot verbalize. Whether Frank ever saw Wilfred in person, I don't know. His son Roger, whom I knew, fellow astronomer, and was here, has been to the house a number of times. He certainly was well aware of it, but I'm not sure whether Frank ever had the opportunity to see. He moved to France in the late 40s, 47, I think. And if he'd ever had an opportunity to see when he came back to the States, did he go to MoMA someplace? I just don't know. I never heard him. I don't recall.
Well, we can ask Roger.
I should ask Roger.
I'll ask him. We'll ask him.
I think they've met in the late 60s in the Netherlands when Wilfred was at the Frank Popper show.
That's a good
Licht von Licht or something like this. So yeah, they met. I think they met. It's in Wilfred's diary, and they've corresponded also. But I mean, from what I remember, Malina said that he came up with, because as Eugene said, the mechanical systems are different.
Of course.
And it's aesthetically kind of far also from Wilfred. It is in the same lineage, I would say. But Malina was a real engineer. And Wilfred was, I think, came up from a different angle.
Pierre Malina very much was an engineer. He was a co-founder of JPL.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, about that. Yeah.
Well, I see that there's another question from Aviva Romani concerning synesthesia, which is certainly part of this discussion. And if anyone would like to amplify on the connection, please do so.
Wilfred vehemently denied any connection. He had wrote one example. Imagine if I moved a microphone connected to a sound, a music generator, moved a microphone across a painting. And
Nice.
And I said, it's ridiculous. With the music generator, when I move to a red part of the painting, create bass sounds, and another part of it was a cool color, create treble sounds. And he said, even as you think about this, you can see how ridiculous the idea is. I'm paraphrasing, obviously.
There's another question or comment, both, from Aviva Romani. I enjoyed all the presentations very much, but I'm surprised synesthesia hasn't come up, as it was certainly what I recall being at the very core to a discussion of his work.
Well, that's what we were just really focused on.
I can add something on that, perhaps. And I completely agree with Eugene. And on what he just said, I think it proves that the problem of the relation between audio and visual in Wilfred is not cultural. It's not this idea of synesthesia, but it's purely technical, because Wilfred example is the selenium cell. So it's like the mechanical system that allows to translate electrical impulses and that allows audio vision to appear in the first place. So Wilfred think of the problem in terms that are purely technical and actually mocks the idea of synesthesia in all of his writings. There are some reminiscent of synesthesia, obviously, because he knew about this history, but he was really against that, and I completely agree with Eugene. And it's again, I think it's a theme of mine, but I think it's purely technical for Wilfred.
May I?
That's interesting. So yes.
May I add another comment coming back to what Ellen and Mickey were talking about originally? Wilfred was adamant about his work being viewed in complete silence, independent art form, and did not want. However, he found that, and I learned this from his son, that in practice, that people found it very difficult to sit quiet in a darkened auditorium for 2 hours. So reluctantly agreed to have what's the word I want? Low tempo, what should I say? Some calm new age music playing in the background. In fact, his son told me, remarked that many times he was the disc jockey, quote unquote, for his father during his performances. He was changing the records. And indeed, there is in the archives at Yale of Wilfred's, for the work he did for Clairol, he put together a list of suggested recordings and even identified the particular Columbia LP number and so on of such music to be played in the Clairol viewing room, the reception headquarters of appropriate music to be played. That was his concession to the reality, and this attention aspect that people find it difficult. On the attention aspect, I did not realize for many years, but when people were viewing, it's easy to talk. And we can pay attention to each other's conversations without of our pleasure of viewing Wilfred's work. Although people know me and have been to the house, and I invite Ellen and the others who've not seen our collection, next time they're in Los Angeles, come see them and sit down in a leisurely situation. But while we're talking, I find myself sometimes just my own enthusiasm just interrupts the conversation. Wow, is my own personal reaction. And then go on.
Well, I think we're running low on time now. So I'm going to say something on behalf of all of us, but especially Mickey, which is a quote. I don't know where it comes from. We see things not as they are, but as we are. And so I think each one of us has had the opportunity today, which I thank you for, Victoria, to show it through the lens of attention. Thanks all of you for your wonderful comments.
Thank you, Ellen, for pulling this together. Really, you did the hard work of inviting the right people. And thank you, Eugene, for joining, and Erky also, and the audience for having the attention. I absolutely did not want to rush this because there's so much to be unpacked, and I learned so much, even though I thought I knew a lot about this work. It's just fantastic to see how someone like Thomas Wilfred can leave behind work that keeps being revisited and rethought and reunderstood. And seeing it from many different angles is really the only way that we can see life in a way that's beyond this one-dimensional tirade of imagery blasting from a television. So let's hope there's more color, light, and motion in our lives, and that we can be in silence from time to time and actually enjoy each other's company over some food. Maybe we get together at Eugene's place and have hours of conversation.
Oh, we look forward to that.
Thank you again, everybody.
Goodbye.